Welcome, everybody, to this session about all things journalistic. My name is Justin Lewis. I'm a professor in the School of Journalism, Media and Culture at Cardiff University, and I also run an innovation program called Cluster. But today we're going to be talking about journalism, old, new, the future of, and I'm very happy to have three very talented young journalists with me today to mull some of these things over. So I'll just introduce our panel, and I think they'll talk a little bit about themselves to start with. But Ciaran Jenkins is a reporter with Channel 4 News. He's a Scotland correspondent with Channel 4 News. But he's also reported from Washington for Channel 4. I'm sure he has some interesting stories to tell about that. He used to work for BBC Wales Cymru, and he's also, I learned today, an accomplished cellist. But I don't think we'll be getting into that. Catrin Jones is a journalist with BBC Wales Cymru. She's recently worked on BBC Wales Live, but she's heading to Westminster to be the political correspondent for BBC Wales. And she's also worked for ITV Wales Cymru as well. And Ciaran Jenkins is a producer on BBC's Beyond Today News podcast, which is very much a new journalistic venture for Radio 4. Before that, Seren worked with the World Service, BBC Wales Sports, and BBC Cymru across TV, radio, and digital platforms. And she recently received her first BAFTA nomination. So well done, Seren. I want to start off, I've got lots of questions that I'd like to ask, and later I'll open it up. But if I could just start by asking our three panellists just to talk a little bit about themselves and their view of the profession they work in, and then we'll get into some of the issues. So, Ciaran, do you want to start us off?
Yeah, I've worked for Channel 4 News for about 8 years now. Before that, I was at BBC Wales. I worked for most of that period at Channel 4 in the north of England, and I came up to Scotland 2 years ago to become the Scotland correspondent. But for any of you who watch Channel 4 News, you'll know that we have quite a free reign as reporters, so we can pop up anywhere across the world. So I spent some time in Asia, spent the summer in Washington, but I'm really thrilled to be back here, which is where I sort of started my career. I used to work in politics for BBC Wales, and I worked on a programme called Dragon's Eye, which some of you may remember. It got axed. Good vote of confidence in that, but it's kind of a good place to cut your teeth as a journalist, because it had a strong emphasis on investigative journalism and actually finding stuff out, which is kind of really should be the basis of what journalism is. And maybe that's getting a bit lost in this sort of modern kind of post-truth era where everything's moving so fast and there's so much emphasis on social media and reacting to kind of breaking news. I think we still need to take a step back and actually reveal things and put the resources, the time and the effort into doing that. And maybe we'll talk a little bit more about that.
Okay. Catrin.
So, as you mentioned, I work for BBC Cymru Wales now on a programme called Wales Live, a current affairs and politics programme that goes out weekly every Wednesday night, but soon to be moving to Westminster for a year's attachment. An interesting time to be there. I joined the BBC back in April 2018, last year. Prior to that, I was at ITV Wales working on current affairs predominantly, but also doing sort of election series when the numerous elections we've had recently have come up. I worked on a programme called GWLAD, which is S4C's flagship current affairs programme, which does allow you kind of that luxury of working on your own stories, really digging and getting to the heart of issues and spending a lot of time researching and investigating. So with them, I covered a lot of local stories, sort of health issues, people just getting done over by various rogues across Wales as well. Also covered things further afield, such as the refugee crisis, and we went to the kind of the Greek islands, bordering kind of with Turkey, just to look at the effect of the migrant crisis there. Been to Israel and the West Bank, covered the independence referendum in Catalonia and the fallout from that. Before all that, I worked on Hacio, which has also been sadly axed. So I share your pain with with these decisions. But that was a great place to cut our teeth. That was a current affairs programme for young people on S4C. That's where I sort of started out in broadcast journalism anyway, and a great place to just kind of learn your trade, really, and really, I think we always talk about how to appeal to young people, but when you're a young person doing journalism, it's just a great way to start off, and I think you instinctively know what to go for and kind of how to talk to your audience without being patronising in a way. So that's a good method of going about it.
Thank you. Seren?
I've been a journalist for 3 years, so I'm still quite new in the industry, learning a lot every day. I got into journalism, I was accepted onto the BBC Journalism Trainee Scheme. It's offered by BBC in all different kind of nations and regions. If you're not familiar with it, there are about 16 people who are graduates who apply for the schemes and get trained up across digital, television, radio, online platforms. So I started with BBC Cymru. So I worked with Cymru View, Radio Cymru, and Newyddion Now. It was a real wake-up call for me because I didn't study journalism at uni. I kind of dabbled with university newspapers, so it was, lots of learning curves. I think it's the best way, though, to kind of get chucked in the deep end and then to just keep your head up and keep going, really. I was there for just shy of a year, and then I transferred over to the World Service, where I decided to work with radio. I wanted to work on programs that targeted people like myself who are under the age of 30. So I worked with a news bulletin program that produces 60-second news bulletins every 30 minutes, 24/7. So it was relentless, and that was the first time I actually started working overnight, which is exhausting, but I feel as though as a journalist, it's a really good thing to just experience having to kind of be alert and be awake and be accurate and correct, all hours of the day, literally. I did that for about a year and a half, and then I moved to the BBC's Radio 4 News podcast as the first news podcast that the BBC launched. We've been going for about a year now, and every day we have a 20-minute episode where we try and unpick a news topic, whether it's a traditional kind of breaking news story or a more quirky, less-known news story that we think hasn't had as much exposure in the mainstream media. So that's my day job. I'm a reporter-producer on the podcast, but in my spare time, I pitch ideas to loads of different other departments across the BBC. I did a couple of documentaries. My most recent one was with the World Service about investigating why there are so little black women who swim competitively when we see them dominate in so many dryland sports. And before that, I did a TV documentary with S4C about Zimbabwe 100 days after the former president, Robert Mugabe, was ousted. I love being a journalist. I think it's a really, really exciting time to be working in the industry. And I'm just quite excited to see, as a journalist, I'm excited to see what's to come. As a human, I'm not quite sure, but yeah, we'll see.
Okay, I want to kick off in a way with the theme of this session, which is to ask you the fairly provocative question, which is, in an era when kind of anybody can be a journalist in some form or another, or they think they can, why do we need journalists? Why do we need you? Who wants to have a crack at that?
You pick. Go on.
Okay. Ciaran, do you want to...
Well, if I said no, I'd be doing myself out of a job, wouldn't I? So that would be quite a silly thing to do. But I honestly hadn't, until you posed this question, and I asked myself the question, and perhaps you would be a better person to answer this because of all the work that you do. But if there weren't journalists, and if there wasn't journalism, imagine a world where we could just sort of remove this entire industry. Would Donald Trump be president? What do you think? If there was no news, if there were no journalists, if all Donald Trump had was Twitter and his own media, would he be president? And I think that's quite an interesting question, because then you start to think about the role that we play in journalism as, whether willing or unwilling, mouthpieces for politicians and people with certain agendas. And kind of our responsibility to respond critically. Not in the sense where you say that's bad, but to think critically in the kind of academic sense to interrogate arguments and to establish the veracity of things that people say. So we do need journalists, but not just any journalists. We need journalists who work with a kind of relentless rigor and vigor interrogating people in the public eye, kind of trying to root out the truth. But it's an increasingly difficult thing to do because of social media. It only takes one little misstep for you to become the story yourself. And inevitably, you're going to disappoint almost half the people all the time. They say, why didn't you challenge this person on that? Why didn't you pick them up on that? And you have to perform these incredible intellectual gymnastics in real time, anytime anyone is talking to you, especially if it's on live TV, or that person is filming it and streaming it themselves, which is becoming increasingly common. So we need people who have the courage to sort of rise to that challenge, because the easy thing to do is to play safe, is to let people's words wash over you, and for their messaging to go unchallenged, because then you don't get into trouble. But that's not really good enough, is it?
Okay. I'd love to pick some of those things up in a moment, but just, I mean, Seren, I mean, what's, in this age of kind of all this information out there, you know, why do we need journalists to tell us what's going on?
I completely agree with what Ciaran says. I think as well, in terms of social media, and actually not really just social media, but in general, there's just, I would say there's almost too much content at the moment. There's so much out there. I think a journalist's job, if they are to do their job correctly, is to streamline that information and to be able to present it objectively with facts and stats. I think we're living in a time where truth is maybe not what it once was. You know, there's lots of people only kind of want to believe their own versions of truth. There's never really one version anymore. And I think a journalist's job is to actually seek out, it's common sense really to seek out that one truth. But I think there are also people who pose as journalists who don't have the same agenda. Yeah, it's an interesting one.
Catrin, any?
Yeah, well, I agree with everything that's been said already. I think it's there's so much information out there. People have access to and create sort of their own information sources. You know, if you think of Twitter, the type of people we follow, it's an echo chamber, you know, known for kind of reflecting what you think. I think a journalist's work is harder because it's competing with other narratives these days. If you put a report out and it tells you X, there are plenty of people who will tell you Y, and it's up to all of us as individuals who we decide to listen to in that sort of scenario. But I think journalists have to fight to try and ensure that what they're presenting is as watertight as possible, because I think our profession is facing a massive challenge. We're under constant scrutiny, as Ciaran says, and we've got to rise to that challenge now more than ever. Fact-checking, giving context, analysis that is robust, I think is more important than ever, and hopefully we can weather this storm and we find our place in whatever comes post, you know, what we're going through at the moment.
I mean, you raised that idea of, I mean, you all work for organisations committed to impartiality, committed to truth-seeking, but those two things aren't necessarily the same thing. So reporting the world impartially, so I'll speak to this person and then this person, might not actually lead you towards somewhere that is truthful. It might actually just be confusing. There's a lot of controversy around the whole EU referendum about whether we were just sort of letting it, too much was tit for tat and not enough kind of unearthing, you know, what the EU does and information about it. Are we negotiating that in the right kind of way? That sort of, well, do we go for truth or do we just stay with impartiality? Because they're not always the same thing. How do we negotiate that? And it's a recent controversy is clearly we've had about that in the last couple of days.
Yeah, I think there are some structural problems with journalism which the news media still has to address. This idea of like a false balance, almost. If, for instance, I think, you know, recently Michael Gove was on the Today programme citing some academics who agreed with the government's position over the prorogation of Parliament versus the Supreme Court. And clearly those two things are not equal. And you might give the example of climate change or the debates around vaccinating children and autism. All these things are areas in which journalism has probably been found wanting and actually doing its duty, doing its sort of its responsibility to audiences on getting beyond the sense of false balance. And the structural problem within journalism as well, inherent within the kind of the craft that we have, which is to try and distill stories into the simplest way possible in order to aid people's understanding who aren't following things as closely as we are. So there's an American writer called Peter Werner who describes a lot of Donald Trump's utterances as incoherent word salad. And if you ever sit through a Donald Trump speech, they can go on for 90 minutes. And he can touch on a wide variety of different subjects. And then you watch the news, or you read a report, and it's there written up for you very neatly. And the central message of whatever that incoherent word salad was has been distilled for you in an easily digestible form. But are we doing someone else's job for them in that sense? And that's a sort of inherent structural question for journalism.
So in that instance, is there a danger that actually journalists are performing a useful communication function for somebody who doesn't actually communicate
Exactly
that well in real life? Yeah, okay. Interesting question. I mean, how about Seren or Catrin? Catrin, in terms of that choice that you've got to make sometimes about, am I going to tell the truth here, or am I just going to say, well, there's this and there's this? Is that something that you found an issue you've had to grapple with at any point?
Well, I can't think of any definite examples of that I've dealt with, but I think it's becoming increasingly difficult to not try and remain impartial, but kind of defining what that is and what road you take with it, and also increasingly unpopular as well, because everything's becoming so divisive and everybody's so polarized these days. It's actually quite unpopular to try and remain sort of in the middle and trying to look at both sides of things. And I think it's something the broadcast media, the BBC in particular, have really had to try and analyse what's going on and how we move forward with that. I don't have any specific examples that I've had to deal with, but I think it is something that we need to address. And as I say, it might be that we're going through Brexit and this is unprecedented times and everything, and we might regain our position and understand what we went through and realise where our strengths and weaknesses were at the end of it. But I think this is going to cause a lot of food for thought in times to come, in terms of what is allowing people to have their say, yet honouring accepted wisdom, I suppose, or where do you challenge it and where do you follow, I suppose. I have no answers on that because I'm just, I'm as baffled as to what the correct approach is as anybody at the moment.
Okay. Any thoughts, Sarah?
I completely agree with what Catrin said. I know that working at the BBC, I'm very proud to work at the BBC, and I'm very proud that we call ourselves an impartial media organisation. I lived in America for 4 years. I went to uni there. My roommate at the time only ever watched Fox News. So that was an experience. And then for my final year, I was kind of more exposed to my new roommate who watched CNN. So there's left-wing news and there's right-wing news. So I appreciate that we are an impartial media outlet, but I also agree and acknowledge that being impartial, I think at the moment, especially for younger audiences, maybe under the age of 30, don't really respect it because they feel as though impartial isn't truthful. So I feel like we're at a time where we really need to maybe, like you were saying, kind of broaden our definition of impartial, maybe just look at it and see if we're really desperate to try and engage younger audiences, how are we going to do so by keeping our BBC values? I think that's the big challenge that we have coming up.
I mean, speaking of challenges and speaking of younger audiences, I mean, for broadcasters, that's a huge challenge because every time we look at the new Ofcom reports on who's watching what, it's becoming increasingly clear that in traditional news outlet terms, people under 30 are kind of dropping off a cliff in terms of news engagement. I mean, they've just gone. They've gone into the wild west of the web. We don't quite know where, we don't quite know what they're learning, but they're not necessarily engaging with traditional news formats. How do we address that? Can we turn that around?
We've just got to adapt, I think. It always makes me laugh because when I was growing up, parents would always complain that we'd watch too much television. Now everybody wants young people to watch television. Please come back to television. This crops up time and again. We've just got to adapt, I think. You know, they are seeking out content. They want to know what's going on in the world. To some various issues and themes and stories will appeal to them more than others, of course, and we've got to respect that and address that as well. But they're out there. We just need to adapt, I think. Increasingly, you know, there's more competition. We've got to acknowledge that, but it goes hand in hand with retaining our position as respected journalists who can provide something that is informative. And well, I won't go down the Reithian kind of principles of what we're doing, but we need to kind of retain our position, and hopefully that will fare us well in the long term.
And do you think there are any examples of that? I mean, and we were talking a bit earlier about S4C and some of the things they've been doing in that area. I mean,
I think it's just online content we've got to kind of work with and find out what works. We're still in a kind of trial and error period with adapting, and I think a lot of work needs to be done on that. But yeah, just kind of where you come in, I suppose, with a lot of the research that you do, it helps guide us in terms of what audiences want, and yeah.
Seren?
Yeah, I think even though, you know, there are young people on digital, I think it's also a bit of a detrimental mentality to have, to think that, oh, everyone under the age of 30 will only consume news when it's a 3-minute video. You know, like young people, people under the age of 35 are the percentage of people who listen to the most podcasts. We listen to podcasts. We watch movies that are 2 hours plus. You know, we read articles on The Atlantic and on Vox and the long reads and shorthand. I think we just need to be a bit more adventurous in terms of not just trying to do and create content that is within, you know, the attention span of what our attention span as an under 30-year-old is meant to be. You know, we are educated. We are more educated than we've ever been. We are engaged. We are curious. We're traveling. These are all reasons that I think why we do want to consume that content that's longer. But if it's not there, then we'll go elsewhere to find it, because there are so many places that we can go. So
broadcasters need to think about telling stories in different kinds of ways?
Yeah, I think so. I don't think there's anything wrong with the ways that broadcasters are telling their stories now. I just don't think it's engaging for everybody. And yeah.
I mean, Ciaran, Channel 4 News probably has a slightly younger demographic than probably most of the other broadcasters, but it's still not that young. Yeah.
And we tend to try and go to where the audience is. So we're making content now just solely for Instagram for the first time. So you can find the Channel 4 News strand there. It doesn't appear on TV. It's just designed for that medium. We're doing the same with Facebook, and we've made an international documentary series that actually appears in vertical form first, like so you watch it vertically on your phone, which is kind of quite a big deal in sort of nerdy news terms, because everything is usually the same shape as the television. And so this for the first time is the actual shape of a mobile phone, which is recognising where a lot of younger people consume their content. I've probably just fallen out of the young person age bracket as well for the first time, because it's usually 18 to 34 or something, isn't it? Yes. So I'm not the best qualified person to talk about this sort of stuff anymore. But I would just put up a defence for TV news, because I think the latest research shows that the average person, you lot, still watch us for 3.5 hours a day. That's incredible, you know? So we're reaching an awful lot of people. 75% of people get their main source of news from the television. So we're still very relevant.
Okay. Just thinking about the theme of this whole celebration, which is celebration of devolution. Here we are in the heart of, literally the heart of devolved Wales. This is the chamber. How good a job do you think we've done of reporting that new reality? I mean, this is a very new reality. Decisions about healthcare, education, very important areas of our lives for people in Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland are no longer made in Westminster. How well do you think we've told that story?
Depends who the we is, I suppose, because on a UK level, I don't think broadcasters have been particularly good at it. I think UK broadcasters, as sort of London-based broadcasters especially, network isn't particularly good at it still. We are struggling. Question time, you know, I work for the BBC. Of course, but I can also look at it objectively. A Question Time was broadcast from the Senedd this week, and we didn't hear a mention of devolution or devolved issues until sort of the final 3 minutes. You know, it should have been brought in sooner. We need to be pushing it more, just because also a lot of audiences in Wales also get their news from network programmes, so it's doing a disservice across the board if we aren't getting that message across sooner. And, you know, we can do as much as we like sort of in BBC Wales to kind of get the message across, but we've got to acknowledge that, you know, there's a responsibility on the network programmes as well, and I think there's room for improvement.
I mean, you both work for network programmes. I mean, do you think the programmes and you're also both keenly aware of devolved issues because of where you come from and where you've worked. How easy is it to get stories out there that genuinely acknowledge the nature of our devolved UK?
I don't think devolution is a particularly sexy word or attractive word, and I don't think it's a word that audiences necessarily like either. I think if we talked instead about representing like communities and people and their lives across the UK, that's probably more helpful. And if you just, from a structural point of view, you think of where most journalists are, press and broadcast, that is in London and the southeast of England. So you have people living in the southeast of England writing newspapers that feed the narratives that are read by journalists who decide the broadcast agenda for the day. And I think the challenge for broadcasters like ourselves is to try and step out of that. And actually, it's not just a challenge, but it's actually incredibly rewarding, because as soon as you do that, you find stories that other people aren't doing, which is the whole point of being a journalist. So you put journalists in places where they can go and find stories that other people aren't getting, and suddenly you start to sort of grow a more successful media organisation. So before I was working in Scotland, 2 years ago, Channel 4 News didn't have a Scotland correspondent. Had one maybe about 10 years ago, but there was a gap in between. And you think of how crucial Scotland is to the current debate in the UK about what's going on. And one of the main stories today is about whether the SNP will support Jeremy Corbyn to become Prime Minister, how likely that is I mean, there'll be an independence vote again, and that the UK will actually fracture and split up. And it's incredibly important. We've got to be there to tell the stories. And then your bosses have to trust you to tell them, and they have to find time in the programme for them. And the great thing about my organisation is they do that. I don't think I can remember a time where I've pitched something and it's had merit and it's been turned down. They will make the space for it if it has merit.
And do you think we tell enough stories that allow us to kind of compare and contrast? Because we have, you know, an extraordinary situation of having 4 different political parties in charge of the 4 devolved governments, all pursuing, and have pursued for some time, different policy agendas. So you have, you know, somewhere like higher education, you have completely different policies around student fees, student grants across the 4 nations. There's a huge opportunity to compare and contrast and say, well, let's, you know, they do that this way in England, let's look to see if it's better in Wales or better in Scotland. Do you think we do enough of that? Because that's a huge journalistic opportunity. I mean, what do you think, Ciaran?
Personally, not that I see. I mean, I'm one of the examples of a journalist who is from a national region and then went to London for those, for kind of career progression. And yes, it has its advantages and disadvantages, certainly, for what I'm doing as a journalist. And maybe one day I will actually come back and, you know, do some more stuff outside of the Southeast. But I think it's quite an interesting one. I think with the network I'm working in, at the moment with Radio 4, like you said before, devolution isn't something very attractive. We do have, I think most organisations based on their locations do have their obligation to report their region, kind of their bubble. We should do more, but we don't. I'm going back to the original question, when it comes to finding news about Wales and Welsh politics and stuff about devolution, mainly I get that from Twitter. I get that from politicians tweeting. I get that from, information from Yes Cymru or their annibyniaeth package that, they can send or you can download. I don't see that from media outside of Wales. And I'm not sure if that's going to change. Maybe it will change, if the United Kingdom does eventually kind of fracture, maybe that will change and they'll think, actually, we should have been talking about this a long time ago. yeah.
Yeah, and I guess, I mean, you're right. The word devolution isn't going to fill anybody with huge excitement. But there are a lot of stories about health. There are a lot of stories about education. And it's hard to tell those stories without actually talking about devolved government, isn't it? I mean, don't we need to do that? And do we do that enough?
I speak to people in different parts of Scotland, and I used to when I worked in Wales, speak to people in different parts of Wales, and you can almost directly substitute the way people feel about Westminster sometimes with the way they feel about Cardiff Bay and Holyrood. I'm not sure how useful just supplanting one political institution for another is in terms of better telling the story of the UK.
Not so much that. It's just that if you're telling a story about, suppose the English health minister wants to do something in the health service, but of course it only applies to England, is it useful in telling that story to say, but let's look at what they do in Scotland and or Wales, because they've got a different approach? I mean, the junior doctors dispute was a good example of that.
Absolutely.
The junior doctors dispute only happened in England.
Nothing cheeses off viewers more than feeling that they'd be completely left out of that conversation, or the way that that's portrayed on television. In fact, you're going to hear a lot about Boris Johnson talking about the NHS in the next few weeks, because that's considered to be like a key focus group thing that Boris Johnson can talk about to win votes. But whenever Boris Johnson talks about the NHS, he's not talking to audiences in Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland.
And should we draw attention to that more often?
Yeah, I think we should.
That rarely does happen. Usually it'll be Boris Johnson talks about the NHS, and viewers may think in Wales or Scotland that they're talking about their health service.
You know, there's an awareness, an active awareness that we are different. So yeah, it's...
Yeah, my audience in Scotland is kind of quite keenly aware of it more because we've got a kind of a stronger indigenous media in Scotland. So that gets picked up a lot more than perhaps it does in Wales, where people, as you say, consume a lot more UK media in the first place.
Can I just raise a particular bugbear of mine at the moment, and it comes back to kind of the whole issue of informing people. I mean, one of the things that we see a lot of now, and it's become a standard part of most broadcast news packages, is the item where the journalist will go to Cleethorpes or Cardiff or whatever it is, talk to a bunch of people, and they will say things that we've all heard people say all the time in the pub, like, why don't the politicians just get on with it? Those kinds of things. You could almost write the script before you do the piece. How is that helpful? What does that tell anybody about anything? I mean, if people want to hear that, they'll go down the pub and hear it. Why do they want to watch it on the news? It's not informing them about the world. Why is that so much a staple of broadcast news now? Is it just to make journalists feel that they're somehow in touch?
What's the alternative?
Well, if you're going to report public opinion, don't you need to report it in a way that is accurate and scientific rather than having a random series of people talking on a microphone?
And is that opinion polls?
Well, at least there is some science there. I mean, they're not flawless, but at least there's some science there.
Where would you be without Brenda from Bristol? Speaking for the nations of the UK.
But she doesn't speak for the nations of the UK. I didn't agree with what Brenda from Bristol said.
Well, you wanted another
and lots of
election.
people didn't. But yeah, sure, there may be some people like that. But that's...
I think it's saying that the individuals that appear in Vox Pops speak for necessarily a broader constituency or for everyone in the UK. But I think people do want to see, like, people they perceive to be ordinary folk like themselves on TV. And that's where you get these moments where somebody just calls something out and just says something that resonates. And quite often they're the most kind of talked about, most shared moments on TV. Not the interviews that we do with politicians or academics or people from think tanks. They're just somebody just saying it as it is. I for some reason, I did one Vox Pop after the Brexit vote that went massively viral, and people still tweet me it. And I was talking to this guy in Barnsley about why he voted to leave, and he said that it was to stop Muslims coming to the UK. He didn't mind free movement within Europe, but it was to stop Muslims coming to the UK. And that kind of spoke to, then, for a lot of people, a broader question about this whole conversation that we've just been having for the past few months. And it was revealing, and it was important, I think.
But that's unusual, I think. I remember hearing a journalist on 5 Live doing Vox Pops and talking to somebody who voted leave and asking them why, and they said, because, we need to take back control. And then the journalist said, and you very rarely hear this follow-up, the journalist said, So, what is it that you'd most like to have control over that we don't have now? What's the one thing you'd really like? And it was clear from the ensuing conversation that the person who'd said that had no idea, couldn't name one piece of legislation that the UK had opposed and the EU had imposed on the UK. And so it was very uncomfortable. And then the journalists quickly twigged that this person didn't know that, so they backed off. But should they do that? I mean, should they go? I mean, the incident you're talking about actually showed somebody saying something that was demonstrably not necessarily very well informed. Should we perhaps reveal that a little bit more? I mean, there's a real fear of doing that amongst journalists, which is that this person must be completely authentic. It doesn't matter what they say, it's a truth. But should we be a little more...
Because I think what you're doing with Vox Pops is you're showing the moment that like a political concept sort of collides with the general public, and that is revealing. So when I was in America recently, I was Vox Popping people about the "go back where you came from" comments, and you can almost see the kind of the feedback loop working in the kind of messaging that people are already using kind of Trumpian talking points in the way that they respond to you, perhaps phrases that they wouldn't have used a week before. And without that, we're not doing our jobs because we're not showing the reality of what is happening in the world. These things are happening. People do say these things. The challenge is not just to do that. So what we do in our program is we go back and we interrogate the kind of systems and the structures which enable those messages to permeate. Now, the whole Cambridge Analytica investigation. We went undercover during the last election in a sort of secretive conservative call centre. How do those messages permeate into the public consciousness that you then hear played back at you in a Vox Pop? So don't blame the Vox Pop. Do the journalism, do the work that shines light on the systems around it.
And I guess, Channel 4 may have a slightly different approach to Vox Pops, because I think you do see on Channel 4 people say things that I suspect, if they're on BBC programmes, you wouldn't have seen, maybe. I don't know, to see what you think. I remember, for example, an interview with a couple, again, who voted Leave, and the man started going to a rant about how much he hated the French. And his wife was kind of, shut up, that's not going to sound good. That's kind of undermining your argument. And Channel 4 let it run, and you saw it.
Yeah.
Would the BBC have shown that?
Yeah, I don't see why not. Yeah, okay. And also on the point of Vox Pops, we do try. Well, in my experience, anyway, I've actually been told, we want a bit of that interaction. If they do say, do allow that challenge and see what comes of it. Like that. I don't know whether that's a new approach or if you look at these things at far broader context than I do, I'm sure. But we are very aware that more of a conversation needs to happen if you're going to Vox Pop people and.
I think one of the problems is that the public opinion doesn't happen in a vacuum. And I would like to see more broadcasters, more journalists kind of investigating where public opinion comes from, where the views you hear in Vox Pops come from. I don't think we're doing enough of that, and I think that's dangerous.
Okay.
And that's what I was going to bring up, because I personally don't like Vox Pops. I think it's a lazy way for journalists to just tick boxes to say that we have spoken to people. And, your experience sounds great, and you've got some really great quotes, but, from the odd time where I watch television news, it's just pointless comments from people that people don't really care or people already know about. So it doesn't add anything to the news piece. It doesn't add anything to the news story itself. If you want to speak to people, why don't we just do a program about people with an intellectual, academic, slant instead? What's the point in giving somebody 15 seconds to say, oh yeah, don't like that? I think it's, if it's good, it sounds great. But if it's not as good as it should be, then I think it's an easy 30 seconds we've just added to our news piece just in order to kind of get that commissioned.
I would argue with a lazy point. They can be a nightmare to do. They're really difficult to do sometimes when you're out on the street in the rain trying to get a range of voices.
Oh, definitely. And I've had that experience a lot of times. But I think it's lazy in the sense that this is the way we do our TV packages. You must have a top line. You must have a piece to camera. You must be walking through a high street. You must have Vox Pops. I think we need to be
editorially, not
yes,
for the
not for the reporter. Yeah.
Okay. I'd like to throw it open to everybody here sitting in the politicians' chairs. But before I do that, can I just ask you just to give us one thought, really, from all of you on something that you would like to see change in journalism over the next 10 years? There's kind of one thing you'd like to see more of, or one thing you'd like to see less of. What would that be? Sorry, springing that on you. But
Yeah, it's a big question.
I would like to see politicians actually answer our questions and turn up. Just the way that they used to do. Because what we haven't talked about so much today is the way that politicians increasingly try to bypass journalists. You can have all the journalists in the world, but if politicians aren't subjecting themselves to scrutiny, appearing on your programs, allowing you to interview them, then what is the point? So it's becoming increasingly common now for people to say to you, before you interview a politician, you can only ask them one question. What good is that? You ask them a question, they give you the answer, and they bugger off. So you're just sort of performing some sort of like augmentation role for their message rather than being able to challenge it. So we need to get back to a place where politicians face proper scrutiny.
And do you think we did that better before, maybe?
I think they were more available before.
Yeah.
And in my recent working life, I've spent a lot of time standing outside kind of secure areas where very senior politicians are appearing and I'm not allowed to go.
Okay.
I think
Catrin.
I've got to echo that anyway, and especially in terms of if we want a better understanding and people to appreciate what goes on here in Cardiff Bay better, I think equally that message applies in Cardiff Bay and to politicians. There's always this complaint that it's not being covered well enough, as I've done today, but also politicians need to step up as well and make themselves available, because we can then discuss what's happening here in depth and at least give us a running chance to explain to Wales, I suppose, what's going on and make that open to scrutiny and challenge.
Okay. Seren, what's your...
I think for me, the change that I would want to see kind of in terms of us outputting content starts from the inside. So I'd like to see more diversity in the newsrooms. The journalism industry is 94% white and 55% male. And I'm not even talking about diversity in, gender, race, sexuality, but just diversity of thought. People who are from different, have different experiences, people who you maybe wouldn't even consider bringing into the industry, because there's no disadvantage of having a diverse newsroom. I can't think, if anybody can think of a disadvantage, please do challenge me and I'll fight you on it. But it would solve a lot of, the mainstream media outlets' problems if we just started to reflect society. And I think we're slowly starting to get there. There's a long way to go, but that's the change that I'm really excited to see. I've only been there, in journalism for 3 years, like I said before, and it's been really refreshing going from home, as much as I love home here, but going to London. And one of the reasons I did go is because I wanted to work with more people who are like me. And it's the capital of the UK, really. So you are going to see more women there. You are going to see more girls there. You are going to see more people from all over the world there. I would love for that to spread out across the country, because then we'd be making some really good changes.
Okay, and I can't resist actually asking, before we throw it open, given what you've just said, what's your view of the recent controversy in the BBC about a reporter talking about Donald Trump and racism?
So like I said before, I'm very proud to work for the BBC. One of its reasons is because of its impartiality value. Having said that, it can be very hard. I've been in talks with senior editors before, where we've talked about the type of language the BBC needs to use. We've talked about when we can call a certain somebody racist and when we can't call a certain somebody racist. And when you know that a certain somebody is racist and he's not keen on people who perhaps look like you or come from different countries, it can be very emotional and very difficult. I'm very happy that the BBC yesterday said that, racism is not impartial. Very glad they came out with that statement. Unfortunately, it's sad that it had to take 40 broadcasters and journalists of colour to sign a letter in order for them to kind of come up with that statement. It's a challenge. It's something I kind of think about every day. But it's something that I am optimistic about, that it will kind of I think there will be a positive in this negative. I think it may affect a lot of non-white journalists in the sense of, where they want to work and what they want to do. But hopefully we can see this as a stepping stone and kind of just move forward.
Okay. Questions? Okay, got quite a few. At the back here, yeah.
It may not be our job to make communication attractive to and most of us here are young, aspiring journalists. But I just wanted to know, how can we help contribute to making it more attractive in the work that we do and the work that you guys have done?
Let's have a go at that. Seren.
I would just say report it in your own words, you know. Be yourself, get the facts, and don't feel as though you have to assimilate or imitate any other, you know, news outlet style. I mean, you know, for example, BBC Training is brilliant, and I'm sure, you know, it's the same said for ITV and Channel 4, but if you want to make it attractive and interesting, just use your strengths, you know. I mean, I'm sure you've had training, and I'm sure you're interesting in yourself. So just have faith in the style that you can go on and deliver that story factually and accurately, I'd say.
Anybody want to add to that, or?
Well, it's a challenge for us as journalists, definitely. We're always trying to look for ways to improve. Have you got any ideas on it, by the way? Just wondering, have you got any ideas in terms of what would help in terms of our output?
Okay. I think there were two questions down the front, so yeah.
Going back to the idea of increasing diversity, actually today in Exeter, BBC Radio Devon are holding New Voices at auditions, and I know that that's happening in Bristol as well, sort of this month. Do you think that that's a solution to that problem, in sort of that diversity will come from local radio and television and sort of go into network, or whether it will just remain a sort of local news reporting on sheep in schools sort of thing?
I think it's a really good start, but you also have to consider kind of how did they promote the New Voices, you know? Is it the same type of people that they're expecting from the same type of schools who do work experience at the BBC? Is it those students who are coming in? Or are they going to marginalised communities in those cities to try and encourage them to come in? Will it leak into network? I'd like to think so, but we have the same issue. At the moment, the BBC is piloting a scheme to try and get more children from working class backgrounds into the building. We need to go out to those areas. You know, we can't expect them to say, oh yeah, I'm going to be a journalist. Let me just go to Oxford Circus and sign myself in and become a journalist. I think it's about going out and encouraging and changing mindsets. For some reason, I think journalism's been an industry where it's been maybe an industry for a few rather than many. But anyone can be a journalist. Like, anyone can be a journalist. I don't know if that sounds stupid, but it's just like, if you have a passion for telling stories, and if you like to talk to people, like, why not? I never thought I'd be a journalist, but like now I'm sitting on a panel talking about whatever I'm talking about, you know? But like, it's really, you don't have to have a journalism degree. You don't have to have a journalism master's degree anymore. When I first joined the BBC, there were 16 of us, and half of us had master's degrees, but like most of us didn't even have journalism degrees. We all studied completely different things. And now they also have apprenticeship schemes where you have 18-year-olds coming straight out of high school, just getting trained, because, you know, they have their own interests, they have their own hobbies. I think we're starting to realise that you don't have to already be this perfect mould in order to be recruited.
Okay, thank you. Catrin, yeah.
Coming back to your points about impartiality, I was just wondering, as you were talking, just about impartiality, and I was wondering when you're talking whether, to what extent impartiality is getting confused with neutrality, and if you can think of any ways that maybe this impartiality is really important for the BBC, what methods could be implied, like imposed on that to kind of halt this idea of being neutral, which is a completely different thing?
That's a tough one.
So neutrality, so do you want to maybe
so
tease that out a bit?
I
so
will
the
do.
Neutrality meaning what? And
That maybe in practice, I was just wondering to what extent in practice of journalism, the idea of impartiality, all the way through this kind of hierarchy of broadcasting, is being confused with neutrality. and that coming out within the news stories and the way that those interviews are being managed, where those difficult conversations aren't happening because of this idea of I have to be neutral, I can't offend anybody, whereas actually the premise is to be impartial. So are there any methods that you can think about that could be performed in a stronger manner?
I think that's a really good question. I do think a lot of people do. I think there's a very fine line between the two. There's a lot of overlap as well. And I think, the recent case with the BBC presenter has made a lot of people ask the BBC to kind of go over their impartiality guidelines. I'm not quite sure. I don't really have an answer yet.
I think it requires leadership. You can't expect individual journalists to go out on a limb and make big editorial decisions on subjects this important, basically. You need that protection. I'm not sure about this specific case, whether the BBC had agreed a policy for its presenters and what they could and couldn't say about this particular issue, but I was actually covering these stories in the US at the time, so I was doing them in real time in Washington. And our program was one of the first to call the tweets racist. And I think while others were still tying themselves in knots, trying to avoid doing so, and sometimes you've got to be bold and you've got to rely on your leaders to be bold as well, and to rise to the occasion, because news moves so quickly. If you spend 48 hours sort of, tongue-tied about calling something that is racist, then by the time you've come around to the right call, you've missed it. It's too late.
I think that's where a lot of frustration, I think, for the BBC in particular, can come from young audiences because of that boldness. And I think it does take courage to come up with that decision, but when something can be as crystal clear as that, you do have to ask, okay, why is it taking us so long to tell the truth?
We're in uncharted waters, and the BBC especially is facing a lot of pressure, a lot of scrutiny. I think the BBC is trying to be correct, but there's no prizes for taking your time to make decisions these days in the fast-moving world that we live in. And, yeah, it's one of the many challenges, I think.
Okay. Question here. Yep.
I just wanted to go back to the issue of whales and devolution and reporting. Quite early on, Catrin, you referred to the industry, and I think that's what we see in Wales here, is there is a very lack of industry. There's a lack of people who are willing to pay for news on Wales, and I get very frustrated. I've worked in public affairs, I've worked in the Assembly myself, and you see so many important decisions taking place here that people just aren't able to access or interested in, even though it really affects them. And you can even see these days with smart TVs, you actually have to seek out BBC Wales sometimes in your settings. So I wonder if I actually think that we do need journalists, and that it is a public service. You can't have government without proper reporting. And so I wonder, does the fact that essentially it is an industry and it's not a public service get in the way of journalism?
That's a very interesting question. Yeah. So basically you're getting to, you want to make content that people will watch and come to, versus providing a service. Is there a tension in that? Well, yeah, there is, and you see it in the various approaches that in news. I know, we don't have the vast options in terms of news providers that Scotland has, for example. But you see a difference between sort of what BBC Wales News will be, ITV Wales News, the different agendas, the news agendas, and so on. It's one of the challenges. I don't know what the answer is, to be honest. I don't know what the answer is, but I think there is room for improvement. Yeah.
I think part of it is a mindset thing among journalists as well. The idea of a political journalist working in a place like this and seeing this as their place of work. I think that's incorrect. I think journalists' place of work is out there where real people live their lives. And those stories emerge organically from the challenges that people are facing. If there's some policy issue that's affecting people, you'll hear about it when you actually interact with people. And you tell the story that way, rather than some kind of policy directive and then some kind of shots from the chamber here. It's going to be far more impactful if you tell the stories where people actually are and where they're being impacted by them, I think.
Okay. Question here and then there. Yeah, so, yep.
Thank you. My question is about diversity again. Regarding how we can get more diverse applicants, because I think that issues in diversity in journalism can start really early. And while outreach is really good, I think there's a bigger picture in terms of how can we change the mindset so that anyone and everyone can think, I can be a journalist. Because I think it's going to be a really long process to get to that stage where anyone who looks like me can think, I can do it. So I was wondering your thoughts on that.
So I'd start off by saying the same thing that I said before, like we have to go into communities in order to have a chance at having more diverse newsrooms. But I also think a lot of this comes to the bosses at the top and people who have the editorial power. I'm working in a building at the moment where there's a wave of young black journalists who are really driven and really hardworking and who want to make it, which is very inspiring, but we're all juniors. We've all just started, and we all realize that there are going to be, it's going to take a very, very long time. In general, it takes a very long time to penetrate those editorial levels. Is that the solution? I think it's definitely contributes to it. And I think it's just a mix of, maybe it's a mix of that and a mix of, we have diversity schemes that are now available across, a variety of different industries. But then once you have people from different backgrounds into the industry, how are you going to develop them and keep them? I think that's something that we're still trying to figure out. Do you guys have anything to add?
I mean, my top boss gave the keynote speech at the Edinburgh TV Festival this year, and they got a lot of headlines because of what she said about Boris Johnson. But it's actually quite revealing in another respect, because she said that she'd been asked recently about the latest Channel 4 diversity initiative, and she said she honestly couldn't tell the difference between that and all the other Channel 4 diversity initiatives that had been in the past few years. Her point is that this needs to be more than a gesture, it needs to be real, and you only change TV by changing the people who make TV.
Translation facilities.
If you are reading well translated, put the headset on.
Sorry, sylweddoli bod fi'n...
Sorry, I noticed. Sat in Lynette Morgan's chair, who is the Minister for the Welsh Language. Can I ask a quick question about equality, where we know about Newsnight 2 years ago when they had the discussion about the Welsh Language Bill. They have Ruth Dawes, who I really respect as a journalist, and Julia Rudd, who I respect as... I don't respect in any way, but we have a problem because we're not neutral. There's a problem with the BBC and news programmes. You have someone talking against being a Nazi, but then you have to have someone who is a Nazi then to give the other side of the problem. Don't you think that's a problem?
Well, I'm sure it is. And you've just given a very good example there of the kind of pickle we can find ourselves in whilst trying to do the right thing, and yet again we fall short of the mark. It is a problem, but these are evolving processes, and we often find ourselves in the position where something which on paper makes sense, but in the real world outside it doesn't, and sometimes we lose our focus on that, most definitely. I believe we're getting better at addressing this and dealing with it and acknowledging that these processes that we have in writing or on paper aren't adequate. We've already discussed what's the difference between being impartial and keeping a balance is, but it's a work in progress. I think so anyway.
Okay. I think there's time for one more question. So there's quite a few hands up. Okay, at the back here, yeah.
So I was just going to ask, should the media probably be more held accountable for what they're representing in terms of devolution in their reporting? So obviously on BBC, they reported that they were going to invest more money into the NHS. And they would say NHS England, But do you think that Ofcom or IPSO should regulate them a bit more so that NHS reporting should be more local reporting than national? Because Wales, England, Ireland will look at that and they won't have education on devolution and might think that that is obviously going to NHS Wales. Do you think that the media should be held more accountable as well as politicians for their reporting?
Yeah, definitely we should be held accountable for that. And we should, in my opinion, it should be made clear, you know, if you're talking about the NHS, which NHS are you talking about? Definitely we should be. I think the accountability happens ever more on social media, and I think, you know, audiences have an ever more louder voice than they've ever had. And I think, in my opinion, I think that does work well in terms of our accountability. I think we are realising that our audiences are taking an active part in our output, and we do have to listen to it. So I think those channels of communication are actually very open between audiences, and more open than ever between audiences and, you know, news providers. So I think that sort of works for me. I definitely keep a keen eye on, you know, responses to what I put out.
Absolutely. More accountability is always going to be a good thing, isn't it? Okay. Yeah. And it's great that so many people are here as well. I'm really encouraged by that. I don't know if you all think that we do need journalists or not, and whether you can press the assembly voting buttons so that we can find out. Maybe we'd be ejected or something if you all vote against us. But it's great that you're all here.
Okay. Well, on that note, I'd just like to thank my three guests for answering lots of questions, not being able to ask them for a change. But so eloquently and thoughtfully. And so if I could give them a round of applause.